Surprise. I came home early.
I'm Tyler Bennett, 51 years old, and I've spent close to 3 decades living the rhythm of offshore drilling platforms scattered across the globe. To most people, that sounds exotic, but the truth is less glamorous. Steel corridors that never stop humming, the constant scent of diesel mixed with salt air, and bunks so tight you can touch both walls if you stretch your arms. That night, in the Persian Gulf, after dragging myself through a brutal 14-hour shift in suffocating heat, I collapsed onto my narrow mattress, boots still on. At 2:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message that would carve my life into a clear before and after. My wife Rachel's text was short, cutting, and designed to leave no room for hope. "I'm done with this marriage. Leaving for California with my new boyfriend Marcus. He's 26 and treats me right. Took our savings too. Good luck figuring things out." She hadn't just ended our marriage. She had attached proof of her betrayal. A screenshot of our joint checking account showing 17 cents where $138,000 should have been. And as if draining our life savings wasn't enough, she tacked on a smiley face like she'd just announced a vacation win. I stared at the glowing screen in the darkness of that steel cabin, eyes burning, pulse hammering in my temples. 30 seconds passed, though it felt like hours of silence pressing down on me. I didn't explode, didn't curse, didn't call her back. I typed only 4 words, "Okay, take care of yourself," and powered the phone down, the act feeling like severing the last cord to a life I no longer recognized. Then I forced myself out of the bunk, walked down the dim corridor to the communal showers, and stood under lukewarm water that smelled faintly of rust. I let it run over me until my shift supervisor knocked, worried I might have drowned. The next morning I skipped the mess hall entirely, not trusting myself to sit across from men who'd spot the storm in my face. Instead, I reported early for duty. My foreman Derek gave me a look now and then, part curiosity, part concern, but he never asked. Out here, we live by an unspoken law. Whatever's falling apart back home doesn't exist until your boots touch solid ground again. We had 14 crew members who counted on us to keep this floating industrial monster running safely. My private collapse would have to wait. It wasn't until my lunch break that I opened my laptop. There, waiting in my inbox like a knife, was Rachel's follow-up strike. Divorce paperwork already filed. Her petition painted me as a man who had abandoned his marriage through career obsession. Her attorney, a well-known shark named Gregory, who'd built his reputation on bleeding men dry. The filing demanded alimony pegged to what they described as my substantial earnings. As if to twist the blade, the document also noted that Marcus, my replacement, was already living in my house back in Lubbock. I closed the laptop with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from refusing to show weakness, even to an empty room. Then I went back to work as if nothing had changed. That evening, after the machinery quieted and the crew drifted toward sleep, I composed a single email to my cousin Patrick, a financial planner in Dallas. The subject line was only 2 words: Protocol Blizzard, a code we'd invented years earlier when joking about worst-case scenarios, but always knowing we might need it one day. His reply came within minutes. "Already moving. Don't communicate with anyone until you're stateside." I had 12 more days left on this rotation. 12 days of 16-hour shifts in crushing Gulf heat while my marriage, my home, and everything I'd spent 2 decades building disintegrated thousands of miles away. Some men might have begged for emergency leave, but I knew what that would signal: desperation. Better to finish the contract, collect my pay, and return to land standing tall. If Rachel thought she'd already broken me, she was going to learn she'd underestimated the man she'd walked away from. Rachel and I first crossed paths 20 years ago at a tackle shop my buddy owned in Lubbock. I remember the moment clearly. She was 32, standing behind the counter, her auburn hair tied back loosely, laughing as she rang up a customer who was convinced bass fishing required rods worth more than a used truck. She teased him with the kind of quick wit that drew people in instantly, and I caught myself lingering longer than I needed to just to hear her banter. I was 31 then, already 10 years into offshore oil work, home between rotations, and helping my friend with inventory. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but something about her confidence, the way she owned every conversation, made me return to that shop more often than I needed fishing gear. 9 months later, we stood together in a modest ceremony, surrounded by a handful of close friends and family. Nothing extravagant, no grand honeymoon or lavish reception, just vows exchanged with sincerity that at the time felt unshakable. By then, I'd built a solid foundation for myself. A paid-off home, thanks to a lucky early investment in a startup drilling company that had been bought out by a corporate giant, and a career that promised consistent, generous paychecks. Stability was my strongest card to play, and Rachel often said she admired that about me, how she could depend on me, how ambition seemed stitched into my very bones. I, on the other hand, admired how she lit up any room she entered. She had a way of turning strangers into friends in minutes, something I, a man more comfortable with silence and machinery, found magnetic. Of course, our marriage came with a built-in challenge, the rotation schedule. 8 weeks offshore, 4 weeks home in the early years. It was grueling, but the money was unmatched. In 6 months, I could earn what most men in town scraped together in 3 years. We made peace with the trade-off. She would hold down the fort, bills, family, social obligations, while I focused on securing our financial future. For a while, it worked. At least that's what I let myself believe. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They crept in slowly, almost invisibly. Around year 13, Rachel began dropping hints dressed up as complaints. She brought up missed anniversaries, subtle digs about whether another contract in Qatar was truly necessary. She'd compare me, quietly but cuttingly, to her friends' husbands, the ones grilling steaks on weekends, sitting front row at Little League games, showing up for birthdays and holidays. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just natural frustration, the cost of the life we'd chosen. By the time I turned 48, the signs were no longer subtle. Rachel stopped asking when I'd be home. She stopped sharing photos of her daily life. No snapshots of her garden, no quick texts about her book club, no little updates that used to bridge the distance. Our video calls grew shorter, her eyes wandering off screen, her tone clipped and distracted. I convinced myself it was normal, that long-distance marriages evolved. That routine simply replaced excitement, but deep down, I felt the shift. Then came last December. I returned from a rotation expecting the same house I'd left, only to find it completely transformed. New furniture, freshly painted walls, different curtains, updated appliances, all without a single conversation with me. It wasn't just a remodel, it was a declaration. When I asked her about it, Rachel simply said she needed something different. That was all. No explanation, no invitation to understand what different meant. I didn't push her for clarity. Looking back, maybe I should have. 8 weeks before the text that detonated my life, I noticed unfamiliar transfers draining from our joint account. When I asked Rachel, she told me we needed extensive foundation repairs on the house. The explanation sounded rehearsed, but I wanted to believe her. Before leaving for my next offshore stint, I drove by the property myself. No construction crews, no equipment, no signs of any work in progress. But parked in the driveway was a silver Lexus I didn't recognize. Its presence so casual, it was as if it belonged there. 6 weeks ago, Rachel stopped answering my calls altogether. No voice-to-voice contact, just the occasional text claiming she was too busy with a new personal project. I thought about cutting my rotation short, flying home to face whatever was unraveling. But after nearly 2 decades together, I decided to trust her word. I told myself she was simply going through a phase, that this too would pass. Then, 4 days before that final message, our neighbor Gerald sent me a photo. A moving van, parked in front of my house, men carrying boxes through the front door. His message was blunt. Thought this might concern you. I stared at that photo for a long time without answering. Maybe I didn't reply because a part of me already knew. Maybe silence felt easier than admitting the truth was finally visible to everyone else. I waited. I told myself the situation would reveal itself naturally. And it did. Just not in a way I was prepared to face. After Rachel's betrayal text, my cousin Patrick called me on the satellite phone. "You need to hear this sitting down," he started without preamble. Then he laid out everything he'd uncovered through his investigation. Rachel had been systematically planning this exit strategy for at least 16 months. Regular transfers to a separate account under her maiden name started modestly, maybe $1,500 here, $2,500 there. Then the amounts escalated dramatically over the past 3 months. Total extraction exceeded $208,000, not just the $138,000 from our joint savings account. The room tilted sideways as I processed this information. That represented significantly more than I'd realized we even had accessible. Patrick continued with more devastating news. Rachel had changed my beneficiary designations on my life insurance policy 7 months earlier. Additionally, she'd taken out a $35,000 home equity line against our house, forging my signature on the application documents. I sat on the edge of my bunk, suddenly hyper-aware of the constant mechanical humming of the rig's generators underneath us. 18 years of shared life, nearly 2 decades of memories and experiences, and she'd been methodically erasing my existence from it piece by piece for over a year. Finally, I asked about Marcus. Patrick had run a thorough background investigation. Marcus Holloway, 26 years old, former fitness instructor with no meaningful employment history for the past 4 years. 3 documented previous relationships with women over 45, each relationship ending within 20 months following a similar pattern. Patrick didn't need to spell out what that pattern implied. Then Patrick dropped the final piece of information. Credit card records showed 2 one-way airline tickets to Palm Desert purchased for the following Thursday, just 5 days away. Rachel wasn't simply leaving me. She was planning to vanish completely with everything she'd stolen before I could even make it back to American soil. After hanging up, I sat in complete darkness in my quarters for a long time without turning on any lights. Just sat there while memories rearranged themselves in my mind, like a puzzle finally forming its true picture. Those mysterious phone calls she'd take outside on the patio, her sudden obsession with fitness 3 years ago, the complaints about money despite our substantial savings. What devastated me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the meticulous planning behind it. The calculated, patient dismantling of our entire life while she smiled at me during video calls, while accepting the money I sent home monthly, while claiming she missed me desperately. Something fundamental shifted in my chest at that moment. The hurt crystallized into something much harder and colder. I retrieved my laptop from my locker and accessed an email account only Patrick and I knew existed. Logged into the holding company we'd established 9 years earlier after I'd witnessed a colleague lose absolutely everything in his divorce. Frostpoint Holdings, named after my grandmother's maiden name, combined with the creek running through her old property. The account balance loaded on my screen. $1.4 million. I'd been redirecting 65% of my actual income there for 9 years. Completely legal, properly declared on tax returns, but separated from marital assets through the corporate structure Patrick had carefully designed. I sent a single email to my attorney in Dallas, initiate Operation Arctic Response. Then I closed my laptop and headed to the mess hall for coffee. For the first time in days, I actually felt hungry. I touched down in Dallas 42 hours after my rotation ended. Patrick met me at arrivals, immediately handing me a prepaid phone and a thick folder of documentation. "She's been calling your regular number constantly since yesterday afternoon," he informed me as we walked toward his vehicle. "The bank froze the account where she transferred funds, standard protocol for large suspicious transactions. They're requiring you to appear in person to verify and authorize." I confirmed she had no idea I was back stateside. Patrick nodded. "Nobody knows except me and Robert." Robert was my attorney. Patrick pulled out his tablet and showed me a series of text message exchanges between Rachel and someone saved in her contacts as M. I scrolled through their conversations, planning their new life together, mocking me for working overseas while they spent my earnings, discussing details about the condominium they'd already deposited on in Palm Desert. One particular exchange from 3 days earlier caught my complete attention. Rachel had written, "Bank froze everything. They need Tyler to verify in person. What do we do?" Marcus responded, "He's still on the platform for another week at least. Tell him there's an emergency with your mother. Get him to give you authorization. You're still legally his wife." Rachel, "He won't answer my calls anymore." Marcus, "Keep trying. We need access to those funds before the condo closing next week, or we'll have to consider Plan B." Rachel, "I'm really uncomfortable with Plan B." Marcus, "It's just life insurance money. He works one of the most dangerous jobs in the world for a reason. Industrial accidents happen constantly." I handed the tablet back to Patrick. My hands remained perfectly steady but felt ice cold. "Are these admissible in court?" I asked. Patrick explained they came from the cloud backup of Rachel's phone. She'd used my Apple account credentials to set up her new device last year and never changed the password afterward. Everything automatically synced to my cloud storage. We drove directly to Robert's office where he'd already prepared comprehensive divorce paperwork, a criminal complaint regarding the forgery on the home equity loan, and an emergency motion to freeze all assets. "There's a significant complication," Robert said once we were seated in his conference room. "Rachel filed a domestic violence allegation against you yesterday. Claims she fled due to ongoing emotional mistreatment and financial control. Says she feared for her physical safety." I stated the obvious. That's completely absurd. I've been 6,000 miles away for the past 8 weeks. Robert nodded grimly. Facts don't matter initially. It's a tactical move to generate sympathy with the judge and justify taking the money. Her attorney is pushing for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning to obtain a restraining order against you and exclusive use of the marital home. So she wanted to ban me from my own property while her boyfriend continued living there comfortably. Robert confirmed this, then continued. Additionally, regarding that home equity loan, she's already spent it. Transferred the entire amount to an LLC registered to Marcus Holloway 2 days after receiving the funds. I took a slow, deliberate breath before asking about our options. Robert outlined our counterattack. File immediately for fraud, forgery, alienation of affection, and criminal conspiracy. Based on those text messages, we'd request an emergency freeze on all her accounts plus the LLC. He slid a document across his desk. Motion to dismiss domestic violence claim with evidence of perjury and false statements. I asked what evidence we possessed. Robert smiled thinly. Your location data from your company's security credentials proves you've been on that offshore platform for 8 continuous weeks. Your passport entry and exit stamps confirm it absolutely. Plus, I've subpoenaed your phone records demonstrating all communications between you and Rachel for the past year. Nothing suggests arguments, threats, or any form of mistreatment whatsoever. I signed everywhere indicated. Robert added one final instruction. You need to appear genuinely surprised when she's served with papers. She cannot know you're back yet. Officially, you're still at sea. I stayed at Patrick's apartment that night, sleeping more soundly than I had in weeks. The following morning, I logged into the security camera system for our house in Lubbock, equipment I'd installed 4 years ago and maintained remotely. Rachel had either forgotten about this system entirely or assumed I couldn't access it from overseas. The footage showed a young man lounging beside our pool, drinking from my collection of single malt scotch, wearing what appeared to be my vintage university hoodie. He was on his phone laughing, feet propped on the outdoor furniture I'd personally built by hand. While I watched, Rachel entered the frame looking anxious and agitated, pacing as she talked on her phone. I couldn't hear audio, but her body language communicated clearly that things weren't proceeding according to her plan. Patrick entered with coffee and opened his laptop. You need to see what I found overnight, he said. He'd spent hours conducting deeper research into Marcus Holloway's background. What he discovered changed everything fundamentally. He's done this exact same thing before, 4 times actually. Patrick turned his screen toward me, showing news articles, civil court records, and social media posts. Same pattern every single time. Meet a woman, usually married, and always financially comfortable. Relationship develops secretly. Woman leaves her husband, extracting whatever money possible. They relocate together. Within 20 months, Marcus disappears with whatever remains. The screen displayed documentation of 4 women across 6 years, all left financially devastated. One was still repaying credit card debt Marcus had accumulated using her information. Patrick's voice dropped lower. There's something else. He was briefly investigated as a person of interest in the death of his 3rd girlfriend's ex-husband. Suspicious single-vehicle accident 7 weeks after their divorce. The man drove off a cliff on a road he'd traveled safely for 15 years. No charges were ever filed, but the implications hung heavy in the air between us. My phone rang, showing Rachel's number on my regular device. I let it go to voicemail. Patrick played the message on speaker. Tyler, please, I'm begging you. Rachel's voice cracked convincingly. I need you to call the bank immediately. There's been a terrible misunderstanding with our account. I was just moving money to a better investment option like we'd discussed, but the bank froze everything. I can't access any funds for groceries or bills. Please call them and authorize the transfer. I'm really frightened right now. We'd never discussed any such investment plan. The performance was genuinely convincing, though. 2 weeks ago, I would have believed every word. Robert called during lunch with an update. She's desperate. The condo closing in Palm Desert is in 6 days. They absolutely need that money. I asked about our next move. The emergency hearing was scheduled for that afternoon with Judge Morrison presiding, a jurist with zero tolerance for false domestic violence allegations. We had my documented alibi prepared and bank documents filed requesting exclusive return of all funds. Robert slid another folder across the table. Your neighbor Gerald sent these to my office this morning. Inside were photographs of furniture being loaded into a moving truck. My furniture, family heirlooms, items that had belonged to my family for generations. They're emptying the entire house, Robert confirmed. Planning to disappear regardless of whether they get the bank money unfrozen? I closed the folder and made a decision. Change of plans. I want to go home. Both men looked at me with concern. Before Robert could object, I clarified. Not to confront them, to watch from Gerald's house across the street. I want to witness this with my own eyes, and I want to be present when they're served papers. I want Rachel to see my face when her entire world collapses. Robert nodded slowly. I'll make the arrangements. As we left the restaurant, a text came through on my prepaid phone from Gerald. They're packing your grandfather's desk right now, the one you spent 6 months restoring. Thought you should know. Some theft goes beyond money. Some betrayal cuts deeper than anything financial. The 7-hour drive to Lubbock gave me plenty of time to process everything. Robert arranged for the sheriff to serve papers at 9 o'clock the next morning. Patrick set up surveillance equipment at Gerald's house across the street where I'd stay overnight. Everything was positioned perfectly. Gerald greeted me with a silent handshake when I arrived just after midnight. He was a retired petroleum engineer who'd worked rigs himself for 28 years. No explanations were necessary between us. Does she have any idea you're watching? I asked once we were inside his house. Gerald shook his head. None whatsoever. They've been frantically busy, packing systematically all day, loading the valuable items first. Another large moving truck is scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning for the final load. Gerald mentioned that a woman with a clipboard had visited yesterday, who looked like a real estate agent. That detail was unexpected and concerning. I immediately called Robert, who promised to check property records first thing in the morning. At 4 a.m., unable to sleep, I sat at Gerald's kitchen table reviewing all the documentation Patrick had assembled. Bank records showing Rachel's systematic draining of our accounts over 16 months. Phone records revealing hundreds of hours of calls to Marcus extending back over a year. Credit card statements showing hotel charges in our own town on dates when Rachel claimed to be visiting her sister in Oklahoma. There was cold clarity in seeing the evidence organized methodically, not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated extraction plan. A deliberate dismantling of everything we'd built together, piece by methodical piece. By sunrise, Robert had texted confirmation that Rachel had listed our house with a real estate agency 3 days earlier. Asking price was 32% below current market value, clearly priced for immediate sale. She'd forged my signature on the listing agreement documents. At 8:30, I watched through Gerald's kitchen window as Rachel and Marcus loaded final items into his silver Lexus. Small valuables easily transported. My grandmother's silver picture frames, the antique pocket watch my father had given me before he passed away. At 8:40, a large moving truck pulled up to the curb. 3 men exited and approached the house. At 8:50, an unmarked sedan parked directly behind the moving truck, blocking it completely. 2 sheriff's deputies and a woman in a business suit emerged. Robert had sent a court officer to accompany them. It's time, I said to Gerald. I walked across the street as the deputies approached my front door. Rachel answered, her expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as the officers identified themselves officially. Mrs. Bennett, we have legal documents to serve you and the gentleman currently on the premises. I stayed just outside her sightline, watching from the edge of the driveway as all color drained from her face. She called for Marcus, who appeared behind her with his arms sliding possessively around her waist in a gesture of ownership. That's when I stepped into full view. The expression on Rachel's face was something I'll remember forever. Shock transforming into fear, then visible calculation. Marcus just looked confused and slightly threatened. Tyler, Rachel whispered. You're supposed to be on the rig still. I replied quietly. Surprise, finished early, then nodded to the deputies to proceed with service. They handed over a substantial stack of legal documents, emergency restraining order against both of them, immediate freezing of all assets, criminal complaint for forgery and fraud, nullification of the house listing, and formal notice of divorce proceedings, citing fraud and criminal conspiracy. You can't do this to us, Marcus spoke up, puffing out his chest in an attempt at intimidation. She's afraid of you. We filed a domestic violence claim for protection. I interrupted calmly. That claim was dismissed this morning by Judge Morrison. Rather difficult to mistreat someone from 6,000 miles away. The judge was particularly interested in your text messages discussing Plan B involving my life insurance policy. His face went completely slack. Rachel stepped forward with tears already forming strategically. Tyler, please. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. I finished her sentence. Protecting our assets by emptying our house. Planning our future by secretly selling our home without telling me? She had no response to that. The court officer stated formally, "You have 30 minutes to remove personal items only, clothing and basic toiletries. Everything else remains on the premises pending court-ordered inventory." As they went inside under supervision, I turned to walk away. "Where are you going?" Rachel called after me desperately. I didn't look back, simply said, "Home." The hearing took place 4 weeks later. I sat at one table with Robert while Rachel and her attorney sat at another. Marcus was conspicuously absent. He disappeared 3 days after being served, taking Rachel's remaining cash and jewelry with him. A familiar pattern, exactly as Patrick had discovered in his background research. The judge reviewed evidence methodically: bank records, forged documents, text messages, location data proving my whereabouts. When she reached the messages discussing Plan B and life insurance money, she stopped reading and looked directly at Rachel with undisguised disgust. "Mrs. Bennett, are you aware of the serious penalties for conspiracy to commit insurance fraud or potentially worse crimes?" Rachel's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. "It wasn't like that, Your Honor," Rachel stammered weakly. "Marcus was just joking around. I never would have actually—" The judge interrupted sharply. "Save it for the criminal proceedings. This court's jurisdiction covers asset division and marriage dissolution only." She continued reading through documents, occasionally shaking her head in apparent disbelief. When finished, she set the papers down and removed her reading glasses. "In my 28 years on the bench, I've rarely encountered such a clear case of premeditated financial deception within a marriage." She looked at Rachel sternly. "You systematically drained joint accounts while forging legal documents and planning to flee the state with marital assets." Turning to me, her expression softened marginally. "Mr. Bennett, while your creation of separate accounts through a holding company might appear questionable to some observers, this court finds that you consistently paid all household expenses, filed proper tax returns, and made no attempt whatsoever to hide assets from government authorities. You simply protected them from potential future claims, which was prudent given the circumstances." Her ruling was swift and comprehensive. All assets transferred by Rachel would be returned to me immediately. The house remained solely my property. Rachel's claims for spousal support were denied entirely. Most satisfying, she referred the forgery and conspiracy evidence to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. As we exited the courtroom, Rachel attempted to approach me one final time. I simply kept walking without acknowledgement. Some victories require no words whatsoever. 7 months later, I stood on the deck of my cabin in the mountains outside Bozeman, Montana. This property had been part of Frost Point Holdings all along. 45 acres of pine forest and meadow I'd purchased 6 years earlier as a retirement plan. Rachel never knew this place existed. The forgery charges against her had been reduced through a plea agreement. No jail time ultimately, but 6 years probation and restitution payments she'd likely never complete. Last I heard, she was living with her sister in Tulsa, working retail management at a department store. Marcus had already moved on to a divorced surgeon in Phoenix, his pattern continuing unbroken and predictable. I'd taken early retirement from the oil company after 27 years. That was sufficient. Between my investments, savings, and modest natural gas royalties from property in Louisiana, I had more than enough to live comfortably for the remainder of my life. Gerald called occasionally with updates from Lubbock. I'd sold that house 6 months ago. Too many memories, none of them positive anymore. He'd helped clear out my remaining belongings, shipping the family heirlooms to Montana and donating everything else to charity. The afternoon mail brought an envelope from Patrick containing final paperwork showing the dissolution of Frost Point Holdings. Its purpose was complete. Assets transferred, taxes paid, that chapter definitively closed. As the sun set behind the mountains, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the porch swing I'd built that summer with my own hands. For the first time in years, absolutely nobody was expecting anything from me. No crew waiting for instructions, no wife pretending to miss me while plotting my destruction. Just silence and the peaceful sound of wind moving through pine trees. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A project manager at a Canadian energy company offering a consulting position. Excellent compensation, minimal travel requirements. Just sharing expertise I'd accumulated over nearly 3 decades. "I'll consider it seriously," I told him honestly, "and I would think about it carefully. But not tonight. Tonight was exclusively for me, for the hard-won peace I'd finally earned, for the life I was living entirely on my own terms for the first time in 20 years.